So you've got this scenario that infrastructure funds and private equity funds who historically would have frowned upon telecoms are now saying, well, actually, hold on. Building fibre infrastructure, so long as I invest properly and I end up with a lien on the asset so that if the name above the door changes but I still own the asset that's underneath, I don't really care, then this is the exact same as building out an electrical grid or a national water infrastructure. It's the same.
Any infrastructure.
Exactly.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're delighted to have a special guest this week. We've got Ronan Kelly from Adtran. You're CTO of Adtran, aren't you, Ronan?
I am indeed, Scott.
So another very grown-up. We're having a good run of grown-up, although we had a chief architect. I'm sorry, that sounds marginally more grown-up than CTO.
They think deeper about it.
There we go. Well, it's just more nebulous, isn't it? Architect, you know, especially when you're not talking about actual buildings. It can mean anything.
Well, we had to ask him to explain what it meant, didn't we?
Well, quite. And we will ask
Then we didn't really understand it after that either.
No. He just sort of basically went, I'm in charge of tons of shit, which was fair enough. So that's all good. We're also going to have a rare non-alcoholic pod because Ronan's a busy man. He's got to fly back to Dublin later on, so we're recording this at 10 in the morning, and even we are not so debased and debauched as to have a beer at this time. So just these is my glass.
I don't know which one's mine.
I think this one's yours. It's had a sip out of it.
Right.
So there we are. Rock and roll.
Cheers.
And what's been going on? It's a short week, not a lot of news. Good thing we have got a guest where we can talk about stuff that he knows about, because we had a short week because
we would have been
bank
struggling.
Holiday Monday, and we're recording this, so we've only got 3 days worth of news, and that news is pretty boring. So there we are. I had a slow start to the week because I had on Sunday night, I had my mate, you've met him, Gavril, his 50th birthday.
Yep.
It's fancy dress. I went as David Coverdale. So I had a bigger blonde, I went like 80s David Coverdale, like here I go again, David Coverdale. So I had a big blonde curly wig and a White Snake t-shirt, which will probably make an appearance on the pod at some stage. And then I wore my dinner jacket with some shoulder pads in it, because he had that sort of jacket and t-shirt.
You should wear the stuff you wore.
The full Monty.
Yeah. That's a dare for you.
That would be funny. And yeah, that went on till 4 in the morning. So even I had to take a breather at one stage, having been spotted on a chair in the garden having a power nap. So that's not very dignified. But there we are. I had some water and I rallied magnificently. And yeah, what about you? Did you do anything on the bank holiday?
Not huge. I just went to see a mate.
You had a couple though, didn't you?
Yeah.
Okay. Keeping in training.
Watched the Matrix latest film, which I thought was really sort of incoherent and even more than the other ones. But
we're wondering what you'd think about it, Pierre. It was better than you thought it'd be.
It's better than I thought it would be. I had really low expectations. I like the bit where
it's just a bit of shit.
They criticize. It's like they're like, do we need another one? Like in the actual movie. You know, they make fun of how
they get all meta and fourth wall about it. Yeah.
It was very weird.
I've just got no great desire to see them. I thought they sort of just slightly deteriorated. I still think the first one's awesome.
The first one was good, but the other ones I've not been impressed by.
Cashing in.
Yeah.
No. Have you seen the latest Matrix, Ronan?
I have indeed.
What do you reckon?
It was good fun with my 13-year-old son. He enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that's what you need. Something like that. Not with a friend at 1 o'clock in the morning after a few drinks. It's just what's going on here.
Oh, okay, so it's not even so full on that a 13-year-old can't handle it.
No, it's perfect for 13-year-olds.
Okay, well that kind of says it all to me. I'll give it a miss. Cool, and we start of a bit of a heat wave going on by UK standards.
Yeah, it's supposed to rain tomorrow though.
No.
Is it? I thought it's just going to be nice for 2 weeks.
Yeah, me too.
That's what I'm counting.
That's my iPhone, and they're always right.
It's got that smell, you know, it smells like summer. You're like, oh, hold on.
London with sun is glorious.
Yeah. Well, and same goes for Ireland, because I mean, you know, England's not much less green than Ireland.
The 3 good days a year that we get, you're absolutely right.
I know. Well, I've actually holidayed in Ireland a couple of times because my sister-in-law's Irish from Southern Ireland, and they lived in Gorey.
Gorey, okay, yeah.
And we used to go to this little seaside town called Courtown.
That's right, yeah.
And it's just absolutely classic, equivalent to an English seaside town. They've got a little mini golf, they've got a little arcade. They've just got people having old school like summer holidays. It's all but putting a hanky on their head. But yeah, there's a real charm to that. I like it. So yeah, Ireland, like England, on the rare occasions it gets it right. It's absolutely gorgeous because it's so green and lush and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so I'm going to have to be much more time disciplined than I was last week because Rona's literally got a plane to catch and Pierre's got some grown-up stuff to do. So I'm going to crack on. We are going to talk about... Firstly, we're going to just talk about Adtran. Adtran is in the fixed line, the optical space. I'm already going to make a fool of myself summarising what you do, so I'll shut up and let you do it. Adtran does some shit in telecoms. And so we'll talk about the company. We'll talk about, obviously, the space in which you operate, both from a technological and from a sort of geopolitical or a broader market sense. So yeah, in terms of Pierre, I haven't really given you much of a cue for doing your captions, but
maybe we'll do no caption.
Well, maybe, but if you have to do them, we'll probably be talking sort of Adtran, optical, and fibre market. There you go. So that's it. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. And you can read what I've got to say on Telecoms.com, especially by subscribing to a newsletter. And you can read what Ian's got to say by subscribing to Light Reading newsletters. I'm not sure. Do you blog?
We do, actually. We have the blogs. They're available on the Adtran website.
So maybe you can see what Rona's got to write on the Adtran website blog. So let's just get straight into it, Rona. Why don't you just do a better job than I have of introducing yourself? So who are you? What do you do? Tell us a bit about your company.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. I'm Ronan Kelly. I'm Adtran's Chief Technology Officer for the EMEA region, Europe, Middle East and Africa. I've been in that role for just over 7 years, I think, now at this point in time. I've been with Adtran for 12 years now, and prior to that I was a customer of theirs for 6 years in the Irish operator space. So I know the company quite well. I've been in telecoms just nudging up on 30 years now at this point in time.
You don't look old enough, Ronan.
Thank you. I'll take that. I'll take that to the bank. But yeah, no, so just over 30 years, mixed experience from both the operator side and on the vendor side over the years, and probably most specific to our conversation today on the fibre side of things, I have served as the president of the Fibre to the Home Council for Europe for 3 years as well. So very, very broad insights into the telecoms industry on a global basis, but particularly the fibre rollouts that are occurring across Europe now at the moment.
Okay. In terms of those fibre rollouts, I want to get onto the sort of nature of the rollouts in terms of the market in a bit. But as I said beforehand, I'm going to lean very heavily on Ian in this subject matter because Telecoms.com, basically, I've been doing this job for 8 years, but I've never had a editorial person above me.
Sure.
So I basically went, okay, it's called Telecoms.com. I better just write about something that justifies that URL. And that's been the extent of my editorial strategy that whole time. And I have to say it's naturally led me more towards the mobile side because that just seemed to have a little bit more going on. I could get my head around it a little bit more as a consumer of it and all that sort of thing. So this is me sort of pre-apologising for my ignorance on the fixed line side of things. So would you mind starting by just giving us a top-down, from the technological side for now, a top-down view of what's going on in the sort of fixed line, the fibre world?
Sure. Absolutely. And look, I can completely understand that perspective, that there was absolutely a lot more going on the mobile side of things for many, many years. The fixed broadband side of the industry arguably had stagnated for quite a while, up until about, let's say, 3-4 years ago, thereabouts. And now what we've started to see is there's a massive renaissance occurring now in fixed broadband infrastructure. We're seeing pretty much the wholesale replacement of all of the copper-based mediums. So when I say copper-based mediums, I mean the telephone line that connects into people's homes, the coaxial cable that delivers cable TV into their homes, where they have been used over the last 2 decades for delivery of broadband connectivity as well as those phone services and TV services. Now what we're starting to see is operators are replacing that infrastructure, and they're replacing it with fibre optic cable. The reason they're doing that is it's multifaceted from the point of view that, first of all, the capacity, the broadband capacity that fibre optic cable can deliver is exponentially larger than what you can do over any of the cable mediums or any of the wireless mediums. To put it in perspective for the listeners, on a single fibre strand, I can deliver over a over 1 million megabits per second over a single connection. Now, this is at a time when there's people in the UK.
Is that a terabit?
I can deliver multiple terabits.
Multiple terabits.
Okay, so typically what we see is anything up to 20 terabits per second on some of the most stretched fibre cables out there. Now, you won't typically deliver that to a household, but the medium itself is capable of that.
That would be nice.
So it's very, very.
You're telling me you'd use that?
So,
Download
you can
the
have this
internet
fibre
in 2
in the ground. This gets the future-proof side of it, doesn't it? Because you can have that there, and then it's a case of the sort of boxes that you've got at either end are the things that change over the next few years. Basically.
Absolutely. So that's the key thing with it. Like we saw this with the other mediums as well. So we saw this with copper. We saw it with the cable connections, where the very original broadband connections were 256 kilobits per second, quarter of a megabit. We've managed over those copper pairs to be able to stretch that using technology like GFast up to a gigabit on very, very short copper loops. On the cable networks that deliver the cable TV service, you can get up to 10 gigabit of capacity with the very latest DOCSIS standards, DOCSIS 4.0. However, we're really starting to reach that inflection point now where the cost of squeezing more out of it is higher than the cost of just replacing it with fibre. And then once you've replaced it with fibre, to your point, Dean, all you have to do then is upgrade the equipment on either end of the fibre to add more capacity in the future, but also your operational costs from power consumption, cooling the equipment in the exchanges, etc., even the number of repairs that you have to do out in the field are a fraction of what they would be for the traditional copper mediums.
Can I just, because there's nobody now really who's sort of defending copper and saying, well, it seems nobody's saying we're going to sweat this for longer and get more out of it. But cable seems a bit different. There's still this argument, there's still this sort of push for DOCSIS 4, I think, is probably the next one in line. I don't even know if it's available yet because I just don't cover cable enough. Yeah. But what's your view of that longevity of that technology, I guess? And
so a lot of this is born out of the I suppose the petrified CFOs within the cable industry looking at the cost of overbuilding themselves with a full fibre network. It's not going to be a trivial investment. And they're looking at, surely there must be a way we can squeeze more out of this thing for another few years, at least while on my watch,
Sweat the assets.
Sweat the assets, exactly.
Yeah.
And absolutely, DOCSIS 4.0 does bring new capabilities, but it also comes with a new architecture. And that moves to what we call a distributed access architecture, where intelligent electronics are going to have to be co-located out in the field very, very close to where the end consumers are. And that's going to result in an explosion in the equipment that they will have to deploy in the field. Historically, the cable industry hasn't really deployed intelligent equipment in the field. They've deployed things like coaxial splitters, they've deployed things like passive amplifiers, basically, non-intelligent active electronics. But now, for the first time, if they move to a DAA architecture with DOCSIS 4.0, they'll have to put sophisticated, intelligent equipment out in the field that has to be managed. It needs to be powered, and most importantly, it needs fibre backhaul. So one way or another, they've got to pull that fibre very, very close to the end users. So what we're starting to see is there's a lot of the cable cos now, when they're looking at this, they start down the path because, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They think cable first because that's all they've ever done. But when they sit down and do the math on it, they're starting to realise, actually, do you know what? It might be for a couple of quid extra that we go the full distance with full fibre. And then once we've done that, the operational savings to the business, because remember, over that full fibre connection, they don't have to deliver power. Whereas if they go to a DOCSIS 4.0 scenario with DAA, they still have to power that equipment in the field. Yep. So that means pulling both fibre and power very, very deep into the network.
So when people like sort of Virgin in the UK are talking about, I think, overhauling everything by the late 2020s and going to fibre, then this is another opportunity for you guys, clearly. And,
without question. And what's really interesting as well is we've seen historically in the cable industry, within the standards, within the fibre to the home industry, we've always typically had two camps. You had the standards being set by the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, and you've had the standards being set by the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. And on the ITU side of things, we had technologies like GPon, which is gigabit passive optical network, and more recently we've had XGS-PON, which is the X stands for 10, the G stands for gigabit, the S stands for symmetric, so 10 gig symmetric passive optical network.
That seems like an annoyingly cryptic way of naming it, if you ask me.
the marketeers were not involved in picking that name. However, on the IEEE side of things, they've always gone down the EPon path, so Ethernet over passive optical network. So they originally had EPon, more recently they've had 10 gig EPon. The cable industry was always aligned with the IEEE standards, while the telco industry was always aligned with the ITU standards. What we've now seen is, with this next wave of moving towards 10 gigabit enabled PON technology like XGS PON or 10 gig EPon, there's a huge portion of the cable industry are now shifting over to the ITU standards. And a lot of this is born out of their belief that as more and more fibre gets built out there, and we see this now in the UK today, where there's, you know, over 100 operators registered with Ofcom to build out fibre infrastructure, that at some point along the way there's going to be consolidation within the market. Yep. And if they want to be able to consolidate cost effectively, if you picture Virgin Media here in the UK, if they're off doing their own thing with 10 gig EPon and everybody that would be a consolidation candidate is doing XGS PON, there's a huge amount of cost there. Yep. So we've seen Virgin Media, for example, and Liberty Global in general say, no, we're actually going with the telco standards, the ITU standards, and we're going to go with XGS PON.
So it's driving people towards the sort of the GPON successors.
Exactly.
I mean, what has happened to things like, you know, EPon, and because I just never hear anything about it until you brought it up.
No, I've got to admit, I didn't even know there was this standard split.
Well, there's another one, BPon, wasn't there, years ago?
Well, BPon was one of the very, very early ones.
Right.
Like that had a total capacity of 622
but it all
megabits per
seems
second.
to now
it's a bit of a non-starter.
Yeah.
It all seems to now be GPon, and also I think a point you made, you know, before we started, was one of the trends is about moving away from point-to-point stuff as well. Yeah. Which is another thing that's kind of accelerating at the moment.
Yeah, without question. So there's a couple of key pieces. Historically, up until about 2 years ago, globally around the world, there would traditionally be about 100 million PON transceivers shipped globally around the world to service the needs of consumers. And what we've typically seen is over 90% of those transceivers would have been GPON based. So all the other technologies would have been split between the remaining 10%. So they never really got that mass market share. It's a scale economies industry. You know, the ones that get the mass market share come down the cost curve quickest and hence become the most attractive out there. What we have started to see is, particularly driven by operators, you know, new startup operators who are trying to differentiate themselves from the incumbent operators out there, and they want to come along with gigabit and multi-gigabit type service offerings that are very cost effective. They started to embrace early on this new XGS PON technology. So they had 10 gig of capacity on each passive optical network that allowed them to comfortably deliver 1 gig or 2 gig or 3 gig type services to their consumers. What we're seeing this year in 2022 now, for the first time ever, is XGS PON will overtake GPON with regard to the volume being shipped out there within the marketplace, and it will continue onwards. And this is where the UK has been very fortuitous, because the UK arguably was very late in getting its act together with regard to rolling out full fibre to the home. But because they were late, most of the operators in the UK market today, like if I look at Adtran's customer base in the UK today, we've over 40 operators deploying fibre to the home equipment in the UK today. Wow. Of that, 92% of those are deploying XGS PON.
Right.
So they've really leapfrogged the whole GPON era. They've just said, you know what, that's...
And what does that mean? I mean, going from, if you've got GPON, let's say, and you're moving to XGS PON, yep. What's sort of involved in that transition? I mean, we talked about sort of putting new boxes in, but sure. I know Nokia, when I've talked to them before, and they're talking about sort of upgrades to what comes after XGS, they have this story about just putting in new line cards, really, and you can do a lot with software.
Yeah, can I add to that? Because I was just going to ask, in terms of me understanding how all this works, I mean, all the fibre itself is just a piece of material.
Piece of glass,
Yeah, a piece of glass, obviously sort of insulated and protected and all that sort of thing. So when we're talking about the technologies, we're not talking necessarily about the fibre, although I think there is some innovation. Like I wrote something about like hollow fibre or something like that. Again, not really understanding what I was
seems to be doing a lot on that.
Yeah. But what we're talking about here is basically the kit at either end of that bit of fibre, yeah?
Essentially, yes. There is one variant on this, and Ian touched on it as well. Historically, when fibre to the home was originally built out around the world, and particularly in Europe, in the Nordics in Europe, this is going back 25 years ago, thereabouts. When they built out fibre to the home connections, they built using a fibre architecture that we refer to as point-to-point fibre. So going from the household all the way back to the telecom exchange, there was a dedicated piece of fibre per household. Now, the beauty with that approach is it's absolutely future-proofed. We talked earlier about being able to squeeze terabits per second down a single fibre. So it's absolutely future-proof, but the challenge with it is, trying to manage all that fibre. So when you've got one fibre coming back in from every single household and bringing, 10, 15, 20,000 households back to one location, that ends up being a lot of fibres to try and manage. But also the cost of delivering the services over that. When you have a dedicated laser sending the signal down through the fibre optic cable per household, now all of a sudden I have 20,000 lasers in a central office. The power being consumed by that really starts to rack up. And what we've seen now over the last 2 years in particular, because of the exploding cost in energy, the operators themselves, particularly those ones that deployed those early point-to-point architectures, are saying, this is becoming a real problem for us now, because we can't pass the costs on to the consumer because we'll lose them to other competitors that are out there. So basically it's bottom line erosion going to the energy providers. So we're seeing...
Tell me all about it.
Exactly. So I'm sick to the backseat. They're trying to tell my kids to turn off lights and TVs.
You know what I mean?
Like that.
We haven't turned the heating on for a month.
I'm not made of money.
But yeah, so what we're starting to see now is where historically it kind of would have been one of those religious positions, from my dead hand, this point-to-point stuff is so much better. They're now recognizing that, when people are doing technologies like XGS-PON that can allow them to connect up to like 128 customers per laser, they're seeing like 40-fold reductions in the power being consumed versus a point-to-point equivalent.
So what's the alternative to point-to-point? Is it like to a local cabinet or something like that?
So the alternative to point-to-point is where you move to what we call passive optical networking. With passive optical networking, I have one laser that connects to a single strand of fibre and then connects out in the field into what we call a splitter. And what that splitter does, it's like a prism basically,
right.
And all it does is it reflects that single source of light down multiple other fibre paths. So basically one laser would go in and that laser could be split up to 128 times, and then each of those splits would connect into the end customer's home.
So clever, isn't it?
So it means A, I've significantly less lasers in the central office, so much lower power bills. B, I'm using much less fibre in the actual network that's rolled out. So for example, where this has proven really, really successful now is in the UK, where the likes of OpenReach offers their PIA offering, their physical infrastructure access offering. A lot of these new altnets that have cropped up in the UK market are availing of that PIA, where they can lease a strand of fibre from point A to point B. They can shine whatever technology down that fibre they choose. So many of them are choosing to deploy XGS-PON and light that fibre with XGS-PON. And down the other end of the fibre that they're leasing off OpenReach, they then employ one of those splitters and then dig their own fibre from that location to each of the end user households. And they can connect hundreds of households on a single fibre.
They're using part of the OpenReach fibre with that PIA offering.
In some scenarios. Not always, not exclusively, but in many scenarios, it allows them to get to market much more fast.
I just had one other little jargon-busting moment there from what you were just describing. What you're describing sounds to me, and presumably isn't, like dark fibre, which we've spoken about. That isn't that keen on.
So that is essentially dark fibre.
Right.
So with PIA, they're able to lease a dark fibre. They're able to lease a duct. So within the network infrastructure.
Because I'd heard OpenReach wasn't too mad about that as a concept, but maybe
they offer it in some circumstances, but not in others. I think under regulation.
Fine. Fair enough.
And I think the argument we've talked about it in a mobile context, mobile backhaul, because the complaint from Vodafone has always been that we can't get dark fibre from OpenReach, and I think that's one of the markets where they're not regulated to provide it, and they do better out of. They have their existing Ethernet based sort of stuff, and there's worry about. I think the argument against when people say they don't want to introduce it and they're opposed to OpenReach, they say it's because they might cannibalise their existing offer. There's more sympathetic arguments about it. I mean, one of the arguments is that if you start regulating things, it just causes problems for other people trying to get into the market, like CityFibre. I mean, they don't want to see OpenReach forced to offer dark fibre at some kind of regulated price.
Sure, because it basically presents more competition to them.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those thorny issues. It's just kind of hard to unpick.
So they do offer this thing that is essentially dark fibre, but to certain customers, such as altnets. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know the restrictions that they employ on who they offer it to and who they do not offer it to, or where they offer it and where they don't. But what I do know is PIA is used extensively across the altnet community to extend their reach.
That point-to-point stuff that you were talking about, I mean, presumably one of the arguments for that originally, before the kind of energy situation became as bad as it has, is that you get you could get a lot more bandwidth to a single home, I guess, because you're not sharing the bandwidth. But I guess the capability is so good now that even when you split it, it's a lot per.
Exactly.
I don't know what we're talking about with. I mean, it's not 10 gigabits per second per household, is it, that you'll be talking about?
No, like typically most of what if you picture on the fibre strand itself, you've got 10 gig of capacity
with
on the fibre strand with XGS-PON. Most of the service providers are going to be selling, they'll have a range of services from 100 meg to 200 meg, 500 meg, 1 gig, sometimes 2 gig. We've got operators like, if I remember correctly, you've got Community Fibre is doing 3 gig, Zoom is doing 2 gig.
So the guys who were marketing those kinds of products would be on XGS-PON, you'd have to assume. They wouldn't be able to do that on just a GPON.
No, that's it.
Network.
Like GPON, so where XGS-PON is a total capacity per fibre of 10 gig, GPON is a total capacity per fibre of 2.5 gig.
Yeah.
And that's in the downstream direction.
Yeah.
Remember we said with XGS-PON, so the X is 10 gig and then the S is symmetric, so it's 10 gig up and down. With GPON, it's 2.5 gig.
I'm starting to warm to the acronym now. It does make some sense.
So with GPON, it's 2.5 gig down, but it's only 1.25 gig up.
Yeah.
So if you ever wanted to do a symmetric service on that, the maximum you could do is 1 gig up and down.
Yeah,
period.
And I'm guessing, like the pandemic, with people working at home, uploading things. I mean, there's talk about a lot more of this happening as well in the next few years. Is making that symmetric thing more important than it has been in the past a bit? Or
absolutely, and like we're already seeing that now. You know, all the video calling, all that sort of thing. A lot of the gaming environments, etc. I've always been a firm believer that the capacity comes first. The capacity precedes the applications, basically. So as more and more bandwidth becomes available, applications evolve to take advantage of that. And we see that now today. You know, if you look at the gaming industry today and go to the game store of Xbox or PlayStation and look at the top 10, there's nothing in there now that's less than 100 gigabytes in size.
Yeah.
Well, in a world when people were getting 10 megabit per second, you couldn't sell product like that and distribute it that way because it would take them 2 weeks to pull the thing down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whereas now, as more and more of these, 200, 500, 1 gig services are becoming available, people can pull down a 100 gig file in 10, 15 minutes, something like that. So it's an experience that users are willing to tap into. As more of the symmetric services become available out there, we will start to see more and more applications taking advantage of the upload capability. And we're already starting to see this. You know, things like home security, managed home security within the cloud, all that sort of stuff are all tapping into that higher capacity that's available out there.
And the point-to-point stuff that you were saying was like the Nordic markets or ones that went to fibre quite quickly. They are now in a situation, presumably, where they're just saying we need to overhaul this and do things quite differently, which would mean putting splitters in and that kind of stuff.
So the interesting thing is that they have the fibre infrastructure built out in a point-to-point architecture.
Yeah.
However, what they can do is they can locate the PON splitter that would normally be placed out in the field. They can locate that in the exchange in the central office. So that means they still preserve that point-to-point fibre infrastructure all the way out to the end users. They're now running XGS-PON technology over that fibre. If things change in the future, some new magical chipset comes along that suddenly makes point-to-point a more efficient technology again and delivers more capacity, they haven't ripped out that point-to-point fibre infrastructure, so they can now migrate over to that new technology if and when that materialises.
And some of the older, the standards, I think you might have mentioned GFast, which is one of those ways of sort of sweating copper a bit longer.
Yeah.
But has this, because a lot of people were talking about GFast a couple of years ago. I think OpenReach was making a big deal about it before it sort of pivoted. But has that momentum that's now behind fibre sort of shortened the duration of
we don't really
GFast?
hear about it, do we?
I mean, I don't hear a lot about it. Is it a sort of
opinion's still divided on whether the dot is still there? I noticed Ronan went with the dot and you didn't. This is clearly a point of ideological schism in the industry.
Is it a sort of dying technology, really, a sort of time-limited technology, do you think, now, GFast?
What we see, so okay, let's constrain that from the point of view of GFast is gigabit capable. Is it time limited? Yes, because at some point along the way, gigabit won't be enough.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's take that as it is. I expect that's probably going to be 10 years from now. But it's at some point it won't be enough. Where we're seeing GFast get a lot of traction, and to be quite honest, we're seeing land grabs occur in certain markets now at the moment, is in markets where you've got reasonable portions of the population living in large multi-dwelling units. The multi-dwelling units are either impossible, as in the building owners will not allow people to run new infrastructure up through the risers and out to each residential unit within those multi-dwelling units, or they're just expensive to do it. So in that scenario, GFast, where you do a fibre to the basement type configuration, and just like you would do with an Ethernet connection if you had structured cabling available to you, in this scenario they don't, so what they're using is the phone lines from the basement up to the residential unit. So typically the copper loops are less than 100 metres in length, and you can comfortably deliver that gigabit experience over that. So the lens with which to look at it through is it's a fibre extension.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So you're really delivering fibre. It's fibre to the building, and then you're just using GFast as a distribution mechanism within the building.
Okay.
And in that scenario, it works well.
Yeah, because I was going to say from how you're describing XGS-PON with the splitter, if the splitter is splitting it such that the data rate is something that's achievable over GFast or G.fast,
both,
then you can see why you'd stick with that for a little while, because you're not technically, in terms of just raw data rate.
Yep.
I mean, I don't understand about the symmetrical part, and maybe
GFast can deal with that as well.
They can handle that.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's something to be said for sticking with that in the midterm.
It absolutely has a role to play. I don't anticipate that we're going to see any operators try and do a nationwide rollout with GFast. I think the role it will play will be in that in-building type deployment scenario.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing the traction with it. We see it in markets like Germany, we see it in markets like Australia, where you've got large MDUs that are they're difficult to refibre, basically.
Because OpenReach's original thing a few years ago is that we've worked out we can use GFast over quite long distances now, and I don't know how convinced people were by that, but it seems like they've obviously pivoted quite a lot, because they've got this now.
Stop banging on about it.
Well, they've got this 25 million homes by 2026 or whatever.
Yeah,
it
well,
is,
it all got a bit political,
project.
didn't it, when Bojo started banging on?
Yeah,
about
I mean that's more of a
targets.
market question, I suppose, than a tech one.
It's
but,
all right. We can.
But
move
from
around.
your perspective on, it might be good to come back to a couple of technology things later on. But
yeah, I've got one I want to
on
come back
the. This amazing number of operators in the UK that have I didn't even know it was that many that have sort of registered with Ofcom to build, and there's a lot that you're involved with that are doing stuff. Is that very much a sort of unique to the UK thing, or do you see a lot of this happening elsewhere in Europe? And why is everybody just piling in? Because obviously not all these companies are going to survive, it would seem to me, and it's just, I'm curious as to why there's this sort of
Feels
fibre
like a
frenzy.
Bit of a speculative bubble, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it does a bit.
There's definitely a touch of gold rush going on there, without question. I think if we look at what the drivers are behind it, I think a couple of things have changed over the last few years that are helping fuel this. I think one is the government realization. If you look at, for example, the top 10 companies in the world by market capitalization, and go look at that 10 years ago, and what you would have seen would be the big petrochemical companies, the big industrial giants, the GECs and stuff like that, and a few banks sprinkled in there as well. If you now go and look at the top 10 companies in the world by market capitalization, they're all tech companies with the exception of one or two.
Yeah.
And that's not lost on governments. They're starting to realise, damn, if we want to give birth to the next Google or the next Facebook, we need to make sure that the next generation that are coming up are proper digital natives. And they're educated in programming, they have connectivity at their disposal, that when that light bulb goes off and somebody has the idea, that the infrastructure isn't preventing that idea reaching reality. So you've now seen across Europe a massive shift in government attitude towards gigabit infrastructure. We have in place, which has been enshrined into law across all the European Union member states, and it was adopted by Ofcom before Brexit as well, which is the European Electronic Communications Code. So the principles within that, which we're targeting that every household by 2025 would be connected with a minimum of 100 megabits per second, which is not that big a deal. But the most important piece of the legislation was that must be delivered on a medium that's gigabit capable. And that was the most important piece. So that way, if people wanted access to a gigabit connection, the medium didn't prevent them from accessing it. They could purchase it. So you've got the big push on the government side of things. But then fibre networks are really expensive to build. So where does the money come from? We know the UK government, for example, put 5 billion in for targeting some of the rural locations to help address the digital divide on that side of things. But what we've also seen is, if you look on in the big infrastructure investment funds, in private equity funds, etc., quite often they would have leaned very, very heavily on safe investments like government bonds, for example, to give safe returns for the people that are feeding those funds. And what we've seen now over the last 5-10 years is, if you look at the trajectory of any government bonds, and particularly the long-term ones, 10-year bonds, 30-year bonds, most of them have gone negative now.
Yeah.
So if you buy a 30-year bond, you're paying them to mind your money, basically.
Yeah.
They've suddenly started putting up interest rates to historical norms, and everyone's freaking out because they've been zero for about a couple of decades, haven't they?
So you've got this scenario that infrastructure funds and private equity funds, who historically would have frowned upon telecoms, are now saying, well, actually, hold on. Building fibre infrastructure, so long as I invest properly and I end up with a lien on the asset, so that if the name above the door changes but I still own the asset that's underneath, I don't really care, then this is the exact same as building out an electrical grid or a national water infrastructure. It's the same.
Any infrastructure.
Exactly.
Could even be like private roads or something.
It's a safe sort of guaranteed
it's
supply.
A safe bet.
And it's better than cash, and it's better than bonds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of these investors, thankfully, are coming at this with, a 25-year time horizon on this. So they're not looking at immediate returns tomorrow.
Yep.
Yeah, not like those Silicon Valley sort of desperate active investors who are looking for returns straight away. That would be silly.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly, like, this is an infrastructure build. There's no getting away from that. So you do need that breathing room, A, to get it out there, and B, to start to extract the returns out of it.
It feels more like the market would operate more like the property market. Like, you buy a house, obviously most of us normally sort of not particularly wealthy people buy a house in order to live in, but we're also gratified by the fact that its price is almost guaranteed to go up over time.
In theory.
In theory, yes. Well, in southeast England, I can't speak for Dublin.
Depends on when you bought in Dublin.
Right, okay. But you feel that loosely over, I guess it depends on the time period you're talking about. It seems like there's similar calculus going on there. It's not going to, it might fluctuate, it's not going to go up that much, but you can be pretty damn sure that in 25 years, that asset, should you choose to flog it, is going to be worth more than you paid for it.
Exactly. And like the lifespan that we expect with the fibre networks, like if you listen to any of the fibre cable manufacturers, they're guaranteeing the fibre cable itself like for 50 years. Now that's the very safe number. Likelihood is, that fibre, if left in reasonable conditions, should continue to operate for potentially up to 100 years. So, like, it's a pretty safe bet that they're going to extract long, safe returns out of it.
You alluded to this earlier, that fibre, and presumably because it's glass, which is almost entirely inert material, it requires less maintenance than a metal, which obviously can rust or whatever, even if it's copper, I suppose.
Yeah. But not only that, so you get corrosion that's building up, but you're trying to pass electrical signals down there.
Yeah.
So they get degraded by degrees of corrosion as well. So the thing doesn't have to be rusted to the point where it's rusted through for the service to stop working.
Oh, is that just the nature of wires, that they get a bit knackered from being used full stop?
They're metallic.
I didn't even know that.
Expands, contracts,
right.
Contracts.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And so, yeah. I mean, back to the sort of broader economics of it. Once the fibre's in the ground, as you say, you're looking at sort of 50 or so years of
50 years should be a very, very safe number. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, you're future-proof from the point of view that, like, today, even with a PON architecture, so we talked earlier about the point-to-point architectures, and we spoke about how, you could deliver multiple terabits if you needed to. Nobody's going to do that anytime soon. But the potential is there. Even in the PON world, if we look at the PON world today, the UK is predominantly deploying XGS-PON. We're now starting to see the rise of that in other markets across Europe. Germany is starting to go down that path. We're seeing it in Italy as well. We're seeing the Spanish market, which has very, very high fibre-to-the-home penetration. A lot of that's born out of huge portions of the population living in multi-dwelling units, but also they tend to allow you to run fibres along the fronts of buildings, so you don't have to dig streets.
Yeah.
So they're able to get the fibre out much more rapidly. But because they rolled out so quickly, over the last kind of 10 years or so, most of their deployment is done with GPON technology. So they're about to move on to this new XGS-PON upgrade cycle as they bring more capacities to users.
Can I just ask on the sort of, this gets shown up in sort of data about how much fibre is available per country, and the UK has never done very well in those rankings. It's starting to go up now.
It's doing a lot better now.
But
It's the fastest growing market in Europe, by the way. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be disparaging about Southern Europeans, but the fact that Spain and markets like Spain and Portugal are sort of so far ahead of everywhere else, it seems, on fibre availability is a bit. It's almost a bit counterintuitive to me that they would take this sort of
disparaging.
They would take this sort of really proactive.
You're trying to say they're too busy sitting in the street sipping wine. Not giving a toss.
My mum has fibre. She had it way before me.
But I'm just curious as to why it happened, because was it a sort of happy accident in a way that things just worked out in a way, or did they do something really proactively to ensure it?
As with all of these things, it's a mix. So one of the key drivers, particularly in the Spanish market, was where a lot of Europe was moving to what we call fibre to the cabinet and deploying VDSL technology and vectored VDSL technology. Spain, the way the copper network was built out, they didn't have the same street cabinet locations deployed as what a lot of the other European operators would have had out there. So they typically had a long loop copper cable going all the way from the central office out to the end users. They didn't have that natural breakout point. So for them to introduce VDSL, they would have to put out a nationwide street cabinet infrastructure to house the equipment. They would have to get power to that location. They would have to get fibre to that location. So
the only thing they could do was
so that was a big cost for them just to consider at the beginning. There is the non-portable aspect of the Spanish market and the Portuguese market, which is the percentage of the population living in MDUs, and then there's the cultural piece, which we touched on there, which is they are okay with running cables along the fronts of buildings and stringing it between buildings and stuff like that. Now, when you hear the reinstatement costs that operators have to dig up a street in London and put fibre in it and then close that back over, you're talking, in the order of £100 per metre.
Yeah.
Wow.
Whereas if I can string, I can go 500 metres.
That just doesn't happen, does it? The stringing stuff. I mean, I see this even in Slovakia, where my wife's from. If I go there, you see lots and lots of sort of cables running overhead, and it's like sort of. I remember things being a little bit like that in parts of the UK a long time ago, but now it all seems to have gone
is on my street,
underground.
I have a pole in front of my house.
You do?
Yeah.
You start going places like India and stuff where they've just got this stuff that's duct taped together.
You look up and it's like looking at a spider's web.
Well, I always remember Romania coined fibre to the tree, where the trees were used as distribution poles. But yeah, look, that gave them non-portable advantages that the other European, like picture Germany. You'll never see an overhead cable in Germany. So, that's just not an option that's available. And also reinstatement costs in Germany.
Is it just sort of NIMBYism that they don't want?
The culture comes into this. It's a large part of it. But to be honest, if you can do it underground, the end result is so much nicer. You have the same connectivity, but you don't have cables strung from poles across your street. And in low density, that's not too bad. But I've seen some poles where you might have 24 cables coming off it, and all of a sudden you're looking at it going, that's a little bit of an eyesore.
My sister has power from a pole, actual electricity.
I'm just, I'm being Mr. Time Management.
Are we running out of time?
Do you mind? Well, we've got half an hour left. Right. I just had one or two more techie questions that I wanted to ask before we move it on to more sort of global stuff, if that's all right. Just two things. Going back to the stuff I didn't even know about with this, what do we call it, EPon? So I didn't know there was a standard split.
Yep.
I guess I want to ask whether there's the possibility of future convergence of those two standards, and if not, how easy it is to switch between them. So I'm just wondering what the broader implications of this standard split are, or whether you think it will just resolve itself over time.
So I don't think we will see a convergence, simply because you've got different bodies vying for existence. I suppose one of the beauties with the fibre infrastructure is the fibre itself is agnostic. It doesn't care which standards you pass over.
At either end.
Exactly. So in principle, somebody could migrate from one to the other. You would have to swap out all the CPE if you were to do that. So that's painful.
That'd be where companies like Adtran comes in. You probably wouldn't mind if they kept swapping it backwards and forwards the whole time.
But EPon share is presumably pretty small.
It is. It's very small, and that's part of the reason why we're expecting to see more and more of the cable community move away from EPon and over towards XGS-PON, because again, it's that scale economies thing. The one that has the market volume comes down the cost curve the quickest. It ends up just being.
Is there a geographical element to it?
There is a touch of it. Predominantly in the US, amongst cable operators, there's a lot of EPon deployed.
Right.
In Europe, there's very little.
What about a future standard split? Because, I mean, this gets into geopolitics a bit, but there's all this concern in mobile at the moment about, oh no, China's going its own way and we're going to end up with 2.6G standards. But,
so we're seeing a little bit of that at the moment, where the next standard that's being developed within the ITU is called G.HSP, and what that is targeting towards is delivering 50 gig symmetric over PON infrastructures. However, there's what's being called an MSA for an in-between standard, which is 25GS PON. And it's not a standard, so this is a collection of vendors that have got together and said, we're going to collaborate and do this thing. But the ITU has looked at it and said, we're not going to get behind that. We're going to stick to G.HSP as the next step within the industry. So what we've seen now is within this MSA, there's 51 members within the MSA. But of those members, only 12 of them are operators. Right. And even amongst those operators, then there's probably 3 or 4 of them that are tier 1 operators, so, large scale. No, we're not. No,
right.
Nokia's leading it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So our perspective, I did the math on it one day, kind of looking at, okay, let's look at the global market to say if all of the operator members of this 25GS PON MSA were to deploy full fibre to 100% of their households and deliver that 25GS PON to every single household, what percentage of the global market would that represent? And it was tiny. It was like, very, very low single-digit percentage. You know what I mean? So it's,
because superficially, I could imagine a company like Adtran favouring an interim technology because it injects a new upgrade cycle into the whole process.
No, not really. From the point of view, the way we look at it at the moment is, first of all, the fibre to the home industry is an infrastructure-constrained industry. You've got to get the fibre out there first. And that's what we're in the throes of doing across Europe now at the moment. Like, if you look at Germany, for example, Germany is, just getting to double-digit penetration now at this point in time. So there's a huge amount of growth left within that industry. We don't need to go anywhere near upgrade cycles. But also as well, like if you look at the lifespan of the different technologies, if you look at GPON today is in its 18th year since it was standardized. And there's still oodles of capacity in it for the vast majority of normal users. The people who buy 100 meg, 200 meg, 500 meg, GPON will be able to service their needs probably for another 3, 4, 5 years that you could continue deploying GPON and still get 10 years out of that equipment. And particularly if you do it where what we describe as a combo PON deployment. So within the OLT, the optical line termination equipment that goes in the central office, each of the lasers, or we call them the transceivers within the industry, they can provide both GPON and XGS-PON over the same single strand of fibre at the exact same time. So that way, on a PON network, I could have one household that has an XGS-PON CPE, the neighbour might have a GPON CPE, the neighbour again has another GPON CPE, then they've got an XGS-PON CPE. So what that allows for is, in a scenario where I might have a user on GPON that's a very heavy user and they're consuming most of the bandwidth that's shared amongst all the other users, I can simply upgrade their CPE to an XGS-PON CPE, and now they're off that GPON bandwidth, and that bandwidth goes back to all the other users to use for the next couple of years. So we believe that combination, if GPON lasted 18 years and likely it's going to be 25 years before ultimately people start to look at it seriously to switch it off, well, XGS-PON brings 4 times the downstream capacity and 8 times the upstream capacity of GPON. So I think it's only reasonable to expect that we get at least a decade out of it. And at that point in time, what we'll see is the chipsets will have evolved. So the current state of the art within the industry is based on 16 nanometer chipsets, and they're optimized for GPON and XGS-PON together in a combo fashion. When you start to move to the next standards, like if you go down the pure standard path of G.HSP, or if you take the non-standard path of 25GS-PON, the impact of deploying that on the current chipsets is you've got to reduce the number of ports that you can serve per chip. So basically you end up halving or quartering the number of ports that are available, or to put it in a different way, particularly with our environmental hats on, you end up doubling or quadrupling the power required to service customers, and none of the operators really want to go down that path. So that's why we're saying, look, okay, the next generation of chipsets is going to be 7 nanometer chipsets. They're going to come out in 2024. By the time we get out to about 2030, right? Which is, where are we? Halfway through 2022 now, so 7.5 years' time. That's when you'll start to see the 3 nanometer chipsets coming out. And at that point in time, we anticipate that you'll be able to do the same port density with a very similar power signature to what we're currently doing with GPON and XGS-PON today. You'll be able to do with XGS-PON and G.HSP.
So the risk for people that are going down this sort of 25 GPON route is that they've made investments and the demand just looks like it's probably not going to materialise.
Correct.
And they end up, does it... I don't want to name particular companies, but is there a danger it sort of sets people back in terms of the 50G PON cycle that they've spent their time on this? And
so the assertion is that there's a need for a next generation of PON in the industry today, because there are enterprises out there that require full 10 gig or 15 gig of capacity, and then there's also small cell that requires backhaul. That's the assertion.
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at the fibre to the home networks that are being built out across Europe today, they're being built out in residential areas. The hint is in the name, fibre to the home. These PON infrastructures are being built out in residential areas. Traditional point-to-point infrastructures have always been built to industrial areas. So the question becomes, in residential areas, how many enterprises are there in residential areas that require more than 10 gigabit per second?
Yeah.
And my gut tells me it's a pretty small number. The other piece then is, and Ian, you'd be more familiar with this than me on the cellular side of things, but if I look at some of the data that's out there with regard to the forecasts for small cell, the numbers, particularly when you take private enterprise small cells, so the private LTE stuff out of the mix, the numbers are very, very modest. You end up by 2026, you end up with, like, if I remember correctly, it's something like 6 or 7 million small cells. Well, of these PON networks, so if you picture a 1 to 32 PON network, we refer to that as an ODN, an optical distribution network. Well, there's over 20 million ODNs deployed around the world already today. So by 2026, I think that number is likely going to be double that, so say 40 million. And then you've got 6 million small cells. You're going to have one small cell for every 8 ODNs. Does that make sense to introduce a new technology to service that? To me, it doesn't stack up. But the other key piece is, if you look at the most of the popular chassis systems, the OLT systems that are deployed out in the industry today, most of them have 200 gigabits per second of backplane capacity into each slot. And then you've typically got a 16-port line card going into each slot. And the thing is, if you introduce something like 25 gig PON alongside GPON and XGS-PON, which is the claim that they can all coexist, now all of a sudden you're at 37 gig per port. You end up with 600 gig going into the backplane where there's only 200 gig of capacity. So now you're heavily oversubscribed on the backplane, which we've never been before in the history of the industry. And the thing that's supposedly driving this is large enterprise who need dedicated services, so they don't want to be oversubscribed, and small cell, which is really tight clocking constraints as well. So in that scenario, you've got these two very sensitive services being fed into an oversubscribed backplane. That makes no sense.
Yep.
So it's, I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to be ironed out in this.
Cool. You talking about the chips, I think, is quite a natural segue into a more sort of geopolitical side of things. Because, of course, there's a bit of a chip shortage at the moment. We hear about it more as ever. You hear about it on sort of high-profile consumer devices like smartphones and all that sort of thing. But perhaps you could give us cars. Yeah, they've been having a nightmare for a couple of years, haven't they?
Well, cars are one of the big catalysts behind it all as well, because they're a huge draw on the industry. They're taking a lot of the capacity out of the industry at the moment.
Yes, indeed. And it's interesting you clarifying the manufacturing processes that predominate on the sort of networking side of it, because there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on to do with fabs like TSMC, because they're the best at the cutting edge, like 3 nanometer or whatever we're at now. And they're Taiwanese, and America and China keeps snarling at each other, and Taiwan's just off the coast of China.
Yeah.
So that comes up. People are forgetting about that for now because Russia's kind of distracted us. But you feel like it's
was Russia the preamble to,
Well, yeah, you just feel like it's on the back burner, don't you?
Yeah.
So anyway, just to pass it to you, could you just give us sort of top line on the current chip situation as it impacts your day job?
So I think the one comment I can definitely make is we've all become a lot more au fait with supply chain over the last couple of years and the nuances that go with that industry. Look, there's no question there has been a much stronger focus on forecasting and planning. We've had to work a lot more closely with our customers to make sure that they're taking it seriously, because normally, I think historically within the industry, when you get a sales guy trying to press a customer for a forecast, it was always deemed that, he's trying to close out a sale, blah, blah, blah. It was looked at through a skeptical lens. But I think what we're seeing now, particularly over the last 6 or 9 months, is the operators themselves are realizing, no, this is real. They're hearing it from enough sources now, and they know they have a role to play in making sure that the vendors that are supplying them have sufficient visibility, that they can put their hands to the equipment, they can manufacture the equipment on time, and more importantly, they can ship it efficiently. Because the one thing that we saw with COVID was, I didn't realize this pre-COVID, but something like 30% of the global air freight is in the hulls of passenger jets.
Right.
So when you stop the world from traveling, all of a sudden 30% of the capacity was instantly wiped out of the industry.
So interconnected, isn't it?
Exactly. So that had a huge knock-on effect for things like the cost of air freight, and also the backlogs that were building up with air freight. Then throw into the mix, sand blocking the rudder of a massive cargo container ship in the Suez Canal. Again, backs things up a bit more. Now, if you look at off the coast of Singapore, you've got massive backhauls of ships that are queuing up there trying to get into the port.
I just saw on Twitter, I saw a map of dots of ships off the Chinese coast because they're having
the sort of shutdown in China.
They're having their latest COVID freak out, and no one, nothing can happen.
So we just seem to be in this perpetual storm of one disaster
feels like
after
that,
another.
doesn't it?
As I described it, I was out for dinner with a customer last night, and as I described it to them, I said, upon reflection, 2019, the world had reached its pinnacle of efficiency.
Right.
And then the wheels fell off the bus.
Pete Tong.
And we're no way near close to getting back to that level of efficiency.
We possibly never will.
We may never will, particularly now with, like you say, the scenarios with Russia, the scenarios with China. We may never get back to that level of efficiency again.
The China sort of approach to COVID, which is just lock things down when there's even a case, but it just seems to be going on and on and on, and it's been a long time. But our company's now looking at there's obviously so much gets done in terms of assembly and production in that market. Has there been a move to just relocate things and use other countries?
Well, to be honest, within Adtran, we stopped manufacturing all our main products in China many years ago. Right. We had moved things out to Vietnam. We'd moved a lot of it into Europe. So Adtran is unique in the fibre access equipment vendors from the point of view that we still have our own production lines in our own headquarters. So we can produce all the products that we sell in the States, in HQ. We have 6 fully automated production lines there that we can produce all the products there. So, when a super tanker decides to park itself in the Suez Canal and all of a sudden that route is blocked from bringing product into Europe, we had the option then to run things up on our own production lines and be able to bring it in through different paths.
And it's quite sort of politically fortuitous, given the noises that the US government's making about trying to onshore more and more stuff. They must be happy that there are companies like yours that have already beaten them to it.
Made in America is really, really important now in the US at the moment.
Clearly.
And they're particularly, what is it, 64 billion they've earmarked for the latest rural broadband funds, etc. But there is a lot of tight mandates on that around Made in America getting prioritized. So we're proud of the fact that we've been in Huntsville, Alabama for 30 years now at this point in time. We have manufacturing staff there, we've software development staff, we've hardware engineering staff.
It's interesting, Alabama, it's not a place you think of as a sort of big sort of commercial centre.
Well, Huntsville in Alabama is known as Rocket City, and the reason it's known as Rocket City is the original rockets that were used to put man on the moon, the Saturn V rockets, the Mercury rockets prior to that, were all developed in Huntsville, Alabama. So you've got this massive concentration of aerospace engineering right on our doorstep. We're actually in the second largest technology park in the US.
Right, which shows what I know about Alabama.
I bet Neil McRae's there all the time. We had Neil on a couple of weeks ago, and he's a massive space enthusiast as well as being sort of into broadband, obviously. So
and pinball machines as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
He's got sort of 3 manias.
Yeah. Now Neil would love that. There's a space and rocket center, literally a 3-minute. Like if you look out the windows of Adtran's headquarters, you can see a full size Saturn V just there.
Wow.
Right.
No way. Couple of hundred. Yeah. I'll show you photos.
Is it a relic or? As like a relic of
a relic, yeah, exactly.
Relic,
so they've two. They've two. They've a vertical one, so fully assembled vertical one, huge, and then they've also got one laid out in the museum that's broken into the stages, laid out horizontally. It's fantastic, really amazing.
Cool.
That's like in that Walking on the Moon video when they're playing the drums on the rocket. Show my age there. That's the police. A couple of other little geopolitical things. So. You were talking about how you're sort of relatively underexposed to China in a sort of manufacturing sense.
Yeah.
Sort of delicate question right now, but I know Ian's been writing a lot about the pressure that telecoms and telecoms adjacent companies have been coming under to do with Russia. Mm-hmm. So just as America's being very pro Made in America, America's been completely unambiguous about Russia, and basically, if you even have a sip of vodka, they're pissed off with you.
Might be overstating it, but I get the sentiment.
Yeah. And how's that been for you? Have you had to sort of suddenly leg it out of there?
No, thankfully, Russia hasn't been a big focus for Adtran.
Right.
It's traditionally. We see certain very low-cost markets around the world, and quite often they tend to be dominated by a lot of the low-cost Chinese vendors within those markets. So we pick and choose our battles carefully. We try and bring a lot of value in the products that we deliver to market. We try and bring that value to customers that they appreciate that value. They buy into it. They're not just looking for the cheapest way of getting something from point A to point B. We had looked at Russia many times over the years, and each time we've looked at it, we kind of went, it's not really a good fit for the type of product that we bring to the market. So no, we did not have to do an exit out of there. So. And
talking about Chinese vendors, all the aggro Huawei's had over the last 2 or 3 years, Huawei's one of the biggest fixed line, fibre, optical, basically competitor of yours. Mm-hmm. Can't have done you any harm, them being basically kicked out of a hell of a lot of markets.
No, I think what it's done is, if nothing else, it's leveled the playing field. We have seen over the last 2 decades fantastic inroads being achieved by vendors from coming out of China, not just Huawei, there's others as well. But we've also seen a lot of discussion, thankfully we see the European Union get involved in this around, dumping on the markets and stuff like that, In the long term, I don't think it serves anybody well to have innovation squeezed out of the industry. And if we reflect on the European telecoms industry, we had a buoyant industry. We had a lot of expertise and capabilities, particularly here in the UK, companies like Marconi and stuff like that have all been decimated because arguably a lot of that. Now, don't get me wrong, those companies did need to shape up and become more efficient and adopt new ways of developing products and so on and so forth. But when you're playing against a loaded deck, it can be very, very difficult to sustain yourself. So I think if nothing else now, we've started to see a leveling of the playing field. We're also very fortunate that our industry tends to work in cycles. And now we've 2 cycles that are playing out at the moment. You've got one cycle, which is a transition from metallic mediums over to fibre mediums. So the industry is out looking for new vendors. So now they're at least willing to talk to all the vendors as opposed to just defaulting to, I'll just go Chinese because it's cheaper. So you're now getting a fair listening to, and then you've got to compete on your own 2 feet. So that's really, really good. The other upgrade cycle then is going from GPon technology or point-to-point technology over to XGS-PON. And again, same rules apply there. The people are now at least willing to have a listen, and then you can go in and compete on your own 2 feet, and you can talk about the innovations that you're bringing to market. You can talk about the disruptive technologies that you're introducing, the new architectures around open disaggregated OLTs and the likes. And what we're finding is when we get the opportunity to explain to somebody that is actually listening, we're winning a disproportionate share of the market. We're doing really, really well. So it has helped, without question, but it hasn't helped to the way you think that, people are just suddenly not doing Chinese anymore. That's not the case. There are still lots of people deploying equipment from the Chinese vendors. For transparency, I deployed it myself in the past. It was good technology when I had deployed it. But all markets have to have proper rules applied, because if you allow somebody to circumvent the rules, then they end up becoming a dominant force in the market. All the other competition gets squeezed out. Nobody wins in the long term with that scenario. Is
the kind of this change in dynamics and looking at local companies perhaps more, but has it encouraged other players to go? And I have heard talk about some of the guys that were more on the sort of optical background in the past taking broadband steps, and then Adtran, interestingly, is involved in this move for Adva as well, which seems like a sort of reverse thing, if you like. But is there kind of a bit of consolidation going on there between those two separate domains, I guess, of the network?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see more of a collapsing of the domain, where historically, if you picture the access domain was copper and the transport domain was fibre. Now all of a sudden both domains are becoming fibre. So the disciplines, the skill sets, the know-how are starting to overlap quite significantly. We're also seeing a big shift within the industry towards open SDN controlled network infrastructures. So if you look at ADVA, just look on their webpage, you'll see how they position themselves out there. And they're very much focused on open disaggregation within the transport domain. And then if you look at what Adtran is focused on from our portfolio development, it's open disaggregation within the access domain. Both scenarios all under open SDN control environments. So now what the operators are able to tap into with the combined entity when it closes out is they will have an end-to-end, basically the way I describe it is from the Wi-Fi device in your hand all the way through to the internet peering point in the data centers. You will have an open end-to-end SDN controlled environment that's available from a single vendor should you choose to go down that path.
Yep.
And it's that accountability. Like what we really see out there is most of the operators really value the open piece, the ability to switch between vendors, etc. They value a lot of the work that's been done by the open source community, but for a lot of them, accountability is really, really important. So when the stuff breaks, they need to be able to pick up the phone and get somebody on the end of the line that can help them. And that's what causes a lot of them to say, well, I like what the open source community is doing, but not quite for me just yet. I'll go with something that at least leaves that path open for me in the future if I choose to go down that path. But in the interim now, while I have to build out a fibre to the home network here and now, I can go with a vendor that's given me a foundation that allows me to go down that path if I choose to.
That's interesting. That's one of the concerns about open source, that you don't necessarily know where problems might have arisen if there is an issue. That's kind of what the resistance is to some extent.
That's where some of the nervousness creeps in, and who stands accountable for it? You know what I mean? If it breaks on a Saturday evening on Christmas Eve, that's
what the kind of question people like Red Hat are constantly fielding.
Exactly.
And sort of reassuring that they've got it covered.
But Red Hat have built a fabulous business bridging that accountability piece.
Yeah.
That's what they bring to the table.
But I guess they're also, if you look at the bits they contribute to, they're right up there at the top as one of the biggest. And I guess that provides an impetus for them to be more involved in it and try and dominate it to some extent, which is...
But like you see Adtran in a similar lens.
Less open.
Well, I don't know, but it's just you have these very big contributors to things like Kubernetes, don't you, which tend to be Google, Red Hat. Actually, Huawei's up there, but...
But the thing is, without those big sponsors, these projects never see the light of day because there's not enough development horsepower behind it. Like we see it now, we're heavily involved with the Open Networking Foundation. We would have been one of the very early investors providing resources to develop projects like Volta and SIBA and stuff like that, which have now resulted in the virtualized OLTs that are being deployed out in the world today. But without corporate sponsors like Adtran, etc., if it's just down to individuals, the development cycle, it doesn't keep pace with the relevance of what they're developing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So by the time they get it finished, it's not relevant anymore. So that's where vendors like Adtran come into play and help.
Do you get sort of just security issues with open source still being voiced, that because there's so many sort of cooks that there's more chance for something to go wrong, perhaps? Or
and again, that's the accountability piece that Adtran brings to the table. So anything that we will take in to the Adtran portfolio that has contributions from the open source community will be analysed and checked line by line, basically, to make sure that we can stand over that and stand accountable for it. Remember, a lot of our customers, sometimes we've direct relationships with government, but a lot of our customers service the needs of government as well. So security is a premium concern for them. So we have to be able to tick all the boxes. And we see that here in the UK, where I forget the agency that we've had to work with here in the UK, but like we've had to go through all the checks and balances to make sure we meet the needs on that front.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to wrap it up because I don't want you to miss your flight, Ronan.
Appreciate that.
But that was a really good chat, and I've certainly learnt a hell of a lot. Good. Partly from a fairly humble starting point, but nonetheless, it was really interesting. And thanks a lot for coming on.
My pleasure.
And consider it an open invitation if you want to sort of do part 2. Whenever you're around. It sounds like you're quite itinerant. So whenever you're around, you know where we are, and just keep in touch.
I'll take that as a compliment. I think that's how you meant it.
Yes. Busy.
But definitely, I'd love to come back. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thanks a lot for your time.
Cheers. My pleasure.
Okay, and that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. And make sure you join us for the next one.